In the last two episodes, we referred to exploitation of tribals in an indirect way intermittently. In this episode, we shall dwell with the issue of exploitation more directly and also look into other related problems. When we think of exploitation of tribals, story goes to the first ever time tribal people came across the non-tribal world, that is, in touch with the so called civilized world and the so called civilized people. The stories of exploitation starts from that moment onwards for any particular tribe in India, in fact anywhere else in the world. But particularly in India, the exploitation tendencies have been very fast, very quick and very varied by the non-tribal people with whom the tribal people came into contact. Gullibility and naivete, simplicity of the tribal people on the one hand, and the craftiness and greediness to make a fast buck and easy money among the non-tribals on the other hand is a perfect combination for the exploitation of the tribal people. There came missionaries later on with the zeal and commitment to help the needy people everywhere in the world. They came to India, they came from the West, they came from the European countries, they came from America. They dealt with the tribals and their problems very meaningfully. They chose the important issues haunting the tribal people, poverty on the one hand and diseases on the other hand. Poverty, as we dwelt with earlier, tribal people never realized that they were poor, but the Western people coming from the materialistic world could easily define that it is poverty that the tribal people are basically suffering from, and then sickness. No doubt missionaries have done yeoman service so far as the tribal people are concerned with respect to their poor living conditions as well as sickly and deadly diseases that they were suffering from. But yet underhand underlying the zeal for converting them. When it comes to conversion from original religion to the Christian religion, we do not know whether this was a positive effect on the tribal people or a negative effect, but somehow this happened. Service motives of the people who were involved in this service to the tribal people cannot be questioned at all. It was very committed, it was very badly needed for the tribal people. When it comes to exploitation, the impact of missionaries cannot be directly referred to as exploitation, because the zeal and commitment with which they came into the tribal world to sort out the problems of poverty and diseases that the tribal people were suffering from, the term exploitation cannot be used at all, because it was real, meaningful, committed, compassionate service that these people employed in order to deal with the problems of the tribals. But yet underhand there was involvement of religious conversion. Religious conversion, we cannot say whether it could be taken as positive or negative, because they are both dimensions. Religious conversion sometimes made tribal people in the neighborhood belonging to different tribes also come together sometimes, maybe that was the positive side, but negative side, Christianity into which the tribal people converted brought out two things. One was a reluctance to accept their own traditional ways and values as any more meaningful now after conversion, and number two, whether Christian conversion made them move away from the larger society of India, we do not know. When we pay the price later on, we may probably realize, but yet in some sense this was exploitation. And then of course, nobody can forget the amount of exploitation tribal people have undergone under the British rule. We know with every name British rule, they decided to rule, and ruling the tribal people was probably the easiest thing for them. And the British rule exploitation of the tribals came in two different ways. One was the more dangerous one, that is direct exploitation in terms of labor, using them for on their plantations to work. And very soon the British people realized the amount of effort and hard work an average tribal laborer could put in for the same duration of time per day was incomparably more than any other labor they could have from outside the tribal world, including part of the imported labor that they had, for whom they had to pay higher wages. In fact, taking in lower level of nutritional intake, an average laborer was able to produce much more work during a given period than the other kinds of laborers. The other way that British rule exploited was levy of taxes. Sometimes it would be suddenly doubled and trebled. That was the kind of exploitation that tribal people had to pay for the imposition of taxes by the British rule for the land that they do not know why they were paying taxes at all, because they had always lived on that land, they had always felt conventionally that they were the owners of the land and the land belonged to them. Why they had to pay taxes on this land was never understood by the tribal people. Then came independence. After India became independent, entirely different vistas opened in the life of the tribals. Again, in the name of development, lot of things started happening in the tribal areas. Tribal people could not realize why certain things were being done in their lives by the government, all in the name of their own welfare, development and progress. Very soon, with so much of money coming in, as we understood earlier, there was very little time, lot of things had to be done in order to bring about change in the life of the people in the tribal areas, and the local governments and the central government got into the act very fast. Sometimes the development programs had been drafted very quick, very fast, without going into much details. Therefore, the administrators who got involved were not quite serious about some of the implementations, maybe out of lack of understanding of the spirit behind the development program, or because there was more money than what was needed for a meaningful implementation of the program. There was certain amount of indifference among the administrators in implementing the programs. And then particularly forest tribals had to face very harsh situations. In fact, the forest laws that were implemented in the forest areas, starting from the very first definition that from now on after independent India, the forest is government property. Therefore, the forest laws were made in order to help the forest as owned by the government, rather than for the people, the tribals who were living in the forest areas. In that sense, forest laws were not made for the tribal people, as if they were made against the tribal people. Now, there is a lack of legislation also in handling the problems of land alienation. In fact, land alienation went on rampantly by the non-tribals in the tribal areas, because development programs allowed for the first time free entry of all kinds of non-tribals into the tribal areas. Given the gullibility of tribal people, it was very easy for the crafty non-tribals to handle the situation in their own favor. And initially, laws against alienation were very loose, they were not very strict. And the tribal people who got into financial problems found credit was not easily coming. There was a total lack of credit facilities, and for a people who had not known monetary economy at all during the generations that they have lived in their own regions, understanding of credit facilities were not easy for the tribal people. So, therefore, they did not even realize that there was lack of credit facilities, because they were not well informed about the different sources from where they could get credit. Well, then using the opportunity, there were measures taken by the government, but very ineffective. In fact, if we think of the biggest of the problem the tribal people faced, especially the forest tribals who were evicted from the forest, and measures taken to rehabilitate them were not sufficient at all for the enormity of the situation. Whether the planners and implementers understood the enormities of the situation at all is again questionable, because for an average tribal who has been asked to move out of the forest, the only word that the tribal knew all his existence, what it means to get rehabilitated, asked to move away from the forest and then live in a place which is totally different, totally new in every sense of the term. And again, in formulating the programs of development and welfare, there were involvement by the government officials, they got involved, it was implemented, but there was always the perfunctory way of functioning by the government people who did not get into the spirit behind the programs, and there was always some kind of a delay or the other in the implementation of the programs itself. It is not that we did not have people who went into the problems. There were teams who were asked to go into the details, analyze the situation, make recommendations, and again bureaucracy came in the way. Implementation of recommendations were always retarded, were always slow, and were always inadequate. And even in this implementation, there was certain varieties of discrimination in implementing it, depending on the people who were to receive this. It is very questionable to look into how under democracy tribal development started taking place. As was mentioned earlier, for the tribal people who went through the process of despoliation, exploitation by the civilized world, the continuity under Indian democracy was nothing new, because for them the entire set of forces that were exploiting them continued to exist. Nothing seemed to vanish from the middle of their way of life as things started changing around them and demanding changes in their lifestyle. And first of all, they did not realize at all why changes were needed in their lifestyle, because they had no role in deciding why the change should be made at all. All programs were drawn outside of the tribal world, miles and miles away in the state and the central capitals, and people in the tribal world did not know at all why certain things were necessary at all. Therefore, when Indian government and provincial government started implementing the so called development programs and welfare programs for the tribals, balance had to be maintained. What kind of balance? We meant balance has to be maintained between the kind of life tribals have been living so far and the kind of life that they were supposed to change. No, it was a different kind of a balance. The people, whether they belong to the voluntary sector or even missionaries and the government, whenever they came into touch with the tribal people, in order to bring about change in them, they maintained a balance, a peculiar kind of a balance. The interactional framework maintained the balance basically in favor of the non-tribals rather than the tribals themselves, irrespective of whether they were government servants or the voluntary agency people or even for that matter the missionaries. For instance, the government people always wanted to have facilities for a meaningful life as government servants. So, a government servant would not be ready to live in the tribal area for the welfare of the tribal people. He would have a more comfortable life. Come to think of it, even missionaries working in the tribal areas would always have their own headquarters in one part of the tribal world where certain minimum facilities for civic life were available. They would not certainly choose the most backward part of the tribal world for them to exist. That means, whoever came into contact with the tribal people in the name of welfare or development programs always chose to keep the balance in one's own favor rather than the favor of the tribal people. As I mentioned earlier, because the development programs were drawn away from the tribal world, tribals themselves did not know why certain things being done. Therefore, whatever they were asked to do, whatever was given to them as benefit was unasked for. So, very ungrudgingly they just accepted what was given to them, but then they did not realize at all, perhaps even to this day tribals do not realize at all the amount of price they have paid for what they have accepted in the name of development and progress of themselves. However, the rudest shock historically in the tribal world came to the forest dwelling tribals when they were asked to leave the forest. As I have been repeatedly telling, the only word tribal people ever knew. In fact, an average tribal living in the forest simply did not know or simply did not bother whether there was a word outside the boundaries of the forest. When they are asked to move out, in fact, not being able to understand why they had to leave the forest at all, and come to think of it, being rehabilitated in an open area in the plains away from the forest, a totally different world. Everything around is new and they had to manage their life over there. And for an average tribal, therefore, development in the shortest definition meant disturbance in life, a total change in life. I do not know whether an average tribal would accept it as development at all if an average tribal ever understood the very meaning of the word development. The greatest irony that happened in all these processes is that the governor of an area had full powers. Whenever the governor came to know of exploitation of tribals in what manner whatever it was, governor had been empowered to take even draconian measures in order to ensure the safety of the tribals. There is no history in post independent India of any governor who used this enormity of power in the name of tribal welfare. Every governor only told the line of whichever was the government that was ruling in that particular area. Therefore, for an average tribal, independence meant a mixed bag. What is mixed? Lot of things being given unasked for. Some of them probably were not quite needed for their everyday comfortable life, but things were given unasked for, they received it. In any tribal area, in the name of development, whether it is forest, mining, collieries, independence therefore meant for an average tribal a total mixed bag. Mixed bag in the sense, lot of things started coming in the name of benefits, unasked for, gratis. They were happy to receive, although some of them may not be needed for their everyday life at all, and they never thought they would need it for their everyday life. So, the other side of it was lot of things started happening in the tribal area, right in front of their eyes and under their noses, but they would not get the benefit. They would not get the benefit of what came out of the efforts in the name of development in tribal areas. On the other hand, they lost their freedom. They lost their only world that they knew, in which they were happily moving around for generations totally unquestioned. But then the so called development program and welfare programs of the government brought in a lot of questions. If you think of an average tribal, there were a whole lot of questions, but not many answers coming around. Big dams, take for instance, tribal people did not know that they were supposed to be living in an area which is supposed to be the catchment area for building a dam. So, they had to be evicted. They simply did not know why they were being evicted, and after all we know, when a big dam is constructed, tribals do not get any benefit at all. Some small mercies, some compensation given for evicting them from that area. Compensation that came too little and came too late. Therefore, migrants began. Tribals started migrating to some neighboring areas, sometimes voluntarily, sometimes perforce. Migrant tribals entered a new world, new economy, and new kinds of people, new kinds of interactions, and simply they did not know what was happening in their lives, and very particularly women migrants. Women migrants compared to migrants of among the tribals in general came under a whole variety of exploitation. You need not start listing, we know what it means when gullible and simple tribals become migrants in a new world, right in the palms of the greedy people in the civilized world. What kinds of exploitation could take place need not be listed. So far in this episode, we have tried to understand a whole variety of exploitation tendencies that the tribal people had to undergo. You can't list people, but then generalizably every non-tribal who came in touch with the tribal person did involve in exploiting the tribal people in whatever manner he or she could manage the situation. And given the naivete of the tribal people, it was not a big challenge at all for the crafty and greedy non-tribal people to exploit the tribal people. Come to think of it, including missionaries, including the so-called government servants who were supposed to be working for the development of and welfare of the tribal people, every non-tribal in some guise or the other got involved in exploiting the tribal people. So far as the tribal people are concerned, the continuity of exploitation, there has never been a break ever since they came into contact with the civilized world for the first time in their lives.